So in this segment, we're going to be talking about Dominic Cummings really going after Matt Hancock and sparing, Boris Johnson and giving Boris Johnson a lot of credit that I don't think that he deserves. But yes, Dominic Cummings was talking to one of the, I think it's the science committee. He was talking to the science committee, and he talked about stuff outside of science, but not looking good for Matt Hancock. That's all I'm going to say about this kind of segment. So, the Prime Minister's former aide Dominic Cummings has criticised the Department of Health and Social Care (DHSC) for short as a smoking ruin in terms of procurement and PPE at the start of the pandemic. And I can see Matt Hancock getting the bullet for this one. Dishi Rishi is come out looking good, and Matt Hancock is going to look very bad after this. He said, so Dominic Cummings said he was asked by Boris Johnson to come in and sort out the huge Brexit nightmare, a nightmare that Dominic Cummings helped to create, by the way. But that's neither here nor there. Well, it kind of is important, but in his first public appearance since leaving office, he also criticised the health department's response to the pandemic. In spring 2020, you had a situation where the Department for Health was just a smoking ruin in terms of procurement and PPE and all of that. You had serious problems with the funding bureaucracy for therapeutics on COVID. Obviously because therapeutics, if you're talking about herbal remedies for COVID, that was simply not going to work. He said the government's chief scientific advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance, had advised Number 10 that the vaccine rollout should not be run out of the Department for Health and that a separate task force should be created. It's not coincidental that the vaccine program worked the way it did. And this is where Dominic Cummings is being, he's lying here. The reason why the vaccine rollout has worked so well is because it was actually given to experts and people within Public Health England who didn't create something new. They used existing features within the NHS and GPs in order to help with the rollout of the vaccine. That's something we'll be talking about in a minute. I don't think the Department of Health and Social Care would have done a good job of dealing with the vaccine rollout, given the way they've dealt with the PPE, procurement situation. I think they would have given a lot of contracts to people who should not have been getting contracts. He goes on to say, we had to have it authorized, to the authorization to have, a different department handle this vaccine rollout by the Prime Minister and say strip away all the normal nonsense that we can see holding back funding. The Vaccine Task Force is a team of almost 200 people at the Department for Business that was established to make sure the UK got promising vaccines. The whole situation of the vaccine, the person in charge of it in the end did a good job, but she was a bit dodgy in terms of allegedly giving out information to people she should not have been giving out information to about how promising the vaccines were. Allegedly. So we carry on. The Vaccine Task Force I mentioned that. Mr. Cummings said, as the country emerges from lockdown, there needs to be an urgent, very, very hard look by Parliament at what went wrong and why. So interestingly, Dominic Cummings is pushing for what looks like a potential inquiry, hopefully a public inquiry, which is interesting because his sort of the alleged role he played in SAGE meetings will come out if it is a public inquiry. So it would be interesting to see why he wants this. One of the most obvious lessons, Cummings goes on to say, is the incredible value, potentially, of getting science and technology stuff right. I mean, no duh, bro. No duh. The disaster that can come if you get it right. The disaster that can come if you don't get it right. I mean, no duh, bro. He goes on to say it was the horrific Whitehall bureaucracy he wanted to strip away. The thing is, the Department of Health and Social Care didn't follow the quote-unquote horrific Whitehall bureaucracy. They bent the rules, and that's one of the reasons why they messed up as badly as they did. So Dominic Cummings, the vast majority of this is nonsense, and we're going to be debunking it in a minute. So this is an article from Open Democracy where they say companies with political connections were given directed to a high priority channel, a VIP lane. for UK government contracts, where bids were 10 times more likely to be successful, according to a damaging report by the NAO. Around 10% of the suppliers referred to the channel by a political contact were awarded a PPE contract, the NAO said. Suppliers without such links, by contrast, had only 1% chance of winning a contract. So you're around 9% more likely to have your contract awarded to you if you went through the VIP lane. These numbers may not look big, but considering the situation that you had people, companies and warehouses within the country that had PPE and they were overlooked for foreign countries that didn't have the PPE in the country, it does show you how flawed the DHSE's procurement of PPE was. More than £10 billion worth of contracts were handed out without competition during this period, which means that prices were higher than they had to be. The spending watchdog found with a special channel set up to allow almost 500 suppliers with links to politicians or senior officials to pitch directly for work. They didn't go through the normal channels. They were not open tender contracts. They were essentially handed out to people who should not have got these contracts. The NAO, which examined whether government procurement followed due process, found examples of contracts, some for hundreds of millions of pounds, being awarded without basic documents that would normally be drawn up to protect against the misuse of public funds. We've also talked about in the past how some of the PPE that was purchased was not safe for use, and that wouldn't have happened if these went through the regular channels. But this is one of the reasons why Dominic Cummings rightfully blasts DHSC, but him blaming a Whitehall bureaucracy is stupid, because had DHSC followed Whitehall bureaucracy, they would not have gotten in the mess as badly as they would have gotten into, and they would not have wasted anywhere near as much money as they did. So this is, that's one, major lie debunked by Cummings. The other one is that it's the NHS that are rolling out the vaccine. That's why it's been successful, not because of Boris Johnson's great success. The only thing that he did was actually give the contract, or give the job to, a group of people who actually deserved it and knew what they were doing. So we look at this article from the FT. Planning began. This is about the vaccine. Planning began long before it was clear whether any of the vaccines being developed at historic speed would win the approval by regulators. Back in the summer, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson put Simon Stevens, head of the NHS in England, in charge of delivering the country's biggest ever mass inoculation plan. So this is someone who is the head of Public Health England, who has expertise, hopefully, within the field, and understands the NHS, and understands, what is possible working within the frame of the NHS, what kind of experts they have, and delivery systems. This is a much more effective way than giving contracts to people like Dido Harding, who has no idea about running a test and trace system. It makes sense to give this person this job. He goes on to say, Stevens chose a different approach. Rather than creating a new system like we did for test and trace, which I guess in some ways we had to do for test and trace, rather than creating a new system, Stevens used existing groups of GPs known as primary care networks, PCNs, which each cover up to 50,000 patients as his main conduit. Each had to commit to vaccinating for 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. In total, around 1,500 vaccination centres have been established in England, including some in football stadiums, with other large venues staffed by 30,000 NHS workers and as much as 100,000 volunteers. And to get this amount of people to be able to do this, you need a lot of planning. And he planned this since November up until when the vaccine was authorized. So he had a while to plan this, and he managed to bring in experts, which we'll be talking about. So some decisions were devolved. PCNs chose their own jabbing sites, for example, but for others, the NHS's ability to compel action through national edict proved useful. So this guy Stevens, devolved and gave away tasks when he thought it was right to do, giving it to primary care networks which were run by GPs, right? Which makes sense because obviously they know what facilities they have within their GP surgery, so they can authorize how many people they can give out these vaccines. It makes sense to do it like this. Planning had moved into higher gear in November with regulatory approvals for at least one vaccine imminent. Emily Lawson, NHS Chief Commercial Officer selected by Stevens to run the programme. So here you have someone who works within the department, not an outsider, being asked to help out. Selected by Stevens to run the programme, assembled military and private sector support. Military support makes sense because one of the things that are really important within the military is logistics. How do you get stuff, cargo, food, whatever weapons to certain areas? It makes sense to bring in the military on this one. Not to mention the military have access to vehicles, so it makes sense. Private sector support makes sense in this context. I'm not against having private sector support only when it makes sense because they have expertise you do not have at hand. So it makes sense to bring them in rather than training new people, which takes time. So I'm not against that. 5 days later, Stevens, and 50 military logistics experts were installed at the NHS headquarters in Skipton House, South London, to help coordinate distribution and set up vaccination centres. So, and it goes on, the article goes on to talk about what the military did specifically. We've got a bit more here. The issue, this is about, this from Lewis Mosley, who says the issue essentially is how do you get into the right arm in the right place? Who works for the program. Each vaccine centre set up outside GP practices or hospitals needs more than 400 items of equipment to function, from needles to fridges and resuscitation equipment. Plantier's system brings together warehouse inventories and information about patients and the readiness of trained staff. The database also keeps a vital total of vaccinations to give the NHS instant progress reports. Plantier said it does not receive or hold identifiable patient data. So by working with this private company, the NHS managed to create a system where they had access to the equipment they had, the staff they had and volunteers they had, and other facilities. This system makes a lot of sense, hence one of the reasons why our vaccine rollout has been so successful. That yes, we have the vaccines within the country that are being manufactured and we're not struggling with the shortage, but the distribution is key. And by Boris Johnson giving by delegating it to someone who has expertise within NHS England, that is Boris Johnson's success, not to take it away from him, but given that he didn't have many options, given how badly members of the private sector dealt with test and trace and other things, he didn't really have much choice, did he? DHSC were useless because they're run by an idiot, Matt Hancock. So he trusted the NHS on this one, and the NHS pulled through. And this is more a victory for the NHS. More than anything, this is an 80% victory for the NHS. This is near flawless levels of victory right now for the NHS. The only major issues I have is that people with learning difficulties were not prioritised, but I think that's more of a government decision rather than an NHS decision. And until I know that for fact, it's very hard to say. But there are issues with the vaccine rollout, but some of that belongs to the government, who have prioritised older people, I believe, rather than people with learning difficulties who have a higher chance of dying from COVID. So what can we gather from this video is that Matt Hancock has gone after Dominic Cummings has gone after Matt Hancock for his department's failure for procurement of PPE, but his conclusion is Whitehall bureaucracy is a problem, is wrong, and this is a classic Dominic Cummings lie here, because what he does is he gives you some truth, but then he gives you the solution, which is a lie. The solution isn't less bureaucracy. The solution is follow the actual channels and be prepared for anything. Be prepared for a pandemic. We already knew that the country was most vulnerable to a pandemic. That research was done under Theresa May, and we had 3 prime ministers, Boris Johnson, Theresa May, and David Cameron, who did not add to Gordon Brown's pandemic stockpile. So if DHSC were actually prepared, they would have been in a far better situation. If they actually looked at what was within the country, like that company Plantier did, and see what warehouses have whatever stuff that we need, then we would have been in a much better position. So Dominic Cummings, his solutions are flawed. For a start, his criticisms are valid. Solutions are flawed. He's giving far too much credit to Boris Johnson, who does not deserve it. Yes, he delegated effectively, which is a good trait of a prime minister, But given that he didn't have much choice but to give it to the NHS and Public Health England, it does not bode well. If you have a limited amount of options and you finally pick the right one, how much credit do you really deserve? Honestly. Anyways, I'm going to leave it there. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.